The day my vision came back, I sat alone in the kitchen and cried for 20 minutes before I did anything else. Not because I was relieved, not because I was grateful, though I was, deeply. I cried because in that same moment, the moment the blur finally resolved into sharp edges and clear light, I realized I had a choice to make, and I already knew somewhere in my gut what that choice was going to cost me. Let me back up. 8 weeks before that morning, I'd had what my ophthalmologist, Dr. Kellerman, called a significant vascular event behind my left eye. In plain English, a small stroke in my vision center. I woke up on a Tuesday in October, and the left side of my world was just gone. Not dark, gone, like someone had taken a wet brush and smeared everything on that side into grey nothing. My right eye compensated quickly the way eyes do, but I couldn't drive, couldn't read without a magnifier, couldn't tell the difference between my coffee mug and the sugar jar from across the counter. I was 67 years old, freshly retired from 31 years working as a civil engineer for the county, and suddenly I couldn't see well enough to read the back of a cereal box. My wife Norma had passed 4 years earlier. Pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal. We'd been married 41 years. Since then, it had just been me in this house, a 4-bedroom colonial in Lakewood, Ohio, that we'd bought in 1989, that we'd raised our 2 kids in, that still smelled like her sometimes when the heating came on in October. My son Patrick lived in Denver with his wife and their 2 daughters. We talked every Sunday. He was a good man, steady, quiet, not one for big displays of emotion, but reliable in the way that matters. When I told him about my vision, he called 3 times that week, offered to fly out. I told him I was fine, that I had friends here, that he shouldn't disrupt his life. He made me promise to call if anything changed. My daughter Renee, no wait, I need to check myself here. I'm getting ahead of myself. I need to tell you who she was to me before I tell you who she showed me she was. Her name was Kimberly. Kim. She'd grown up her mother's daughter. Bright, social, with Norma's dark eyes and her talent for making any room feel warm when she walked in. I'd coached her soccer team when she was 9. I'd taught her to drive in an empty church parking lot on a Sunday afternoon, both of us laughing when she clipped the curb. I'd walked her down the aisle 6 years ago when she married a man named Spencer, who worked in commercial real estate and had the kind of easy confidence that I'd always slightly distrusted but never acted on. Kim lived 20 minutes from me. She was the one who drove me to my follow-up appointments after the vision event. She was the one who stocked my freezer with casseroles in labeled containers. She set up a whiteboard on my kitchen counter so I could write notes if I needed to communicate something I didn't want to shout across the room. I was grateful. I told her so. I meant it. What I didn't know was what she and Spencer were saying when they thought I couldn't see their faces clearly enough to read them. Here's what Dr. Kellerman had actually told me in our 3rd appointment, that the damage was unusual, that in some cases of this type the affected area could partially or fully recover, that the brain was more plastic than people assumed, and that I should come back in 6 weeks. He didn't make any promises. He told me not to get my hopes up, but also not to give up. I left that appointment holding those 2 instructions like 2 buckets of water, trying not to spill either one. 6 weeks later, I drove myself to that appointment. Not legally, I know. But it was 7 in the morning and a half mile, and I could see well enough by then to know I wasn't going to hurt anyone. That was the first sign, actually, I realized 2 days before the appointment, that I'd been reading the newspaper without the magnifier. I hadn't even noticed at first. I just picked it up and read it. Dr. Kellerman ran his tests, looked in my eye for a long time without speaking. Then he put his scope down and said, "Well, I'll be damned." Nearly full recovery, not complete. There was still a small region of reduced sensitivity in the upper left quadrant of my visual field, and he wanted me to come back in 3 months. But functionally, I could drive, I could read, I could see my grandchildren's faces on a video call without squinting. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the medical building for a long time, and I thought about Kim. I thought about something I'd seen 2 weeks earlier. Or rather, something I'd seen more clearly than Kim knew I could see. She and Spencer had come over on a Saturday afternoon, supposedly to help me organize some paperwork. Kim had gone upstairs to get something from the guest room. Spencer was at the kitchen table, and he'd made a phone call. He'd half turned away from me, the way people do when they think they're being private in a shared space. I was sitting in the armchair near the window. He thought my vision was too poor to read his expression at that distance. He was wrong. By that point it wasn't. I couldn't hear the call, but I watched his face. I watched him gesture toward the ceiling, toward the house, toward the upstairs, toward the structure around him. I watched him hold up fingers, what looked like numbers. I watched him nod slowly, the way someone nods when they're hearing confirmation of something they'd hoped for. And I watched his face settle into an expression I recognized immediately because I'd seen it before, in negotiations across conference tables, the look of a man who's already decided something and is now working backward toward justification. I didn't know what he was talking about, not specifically, but I knew the conversation wasn't about me. It was about my house. That's why, when Dr. Kellerman told me my vision had come back, I didn't call Kim first. I drove home, made a cup of coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and made a decision. I was going to keep quiet, just for a little while, long enough to find out what was really going on. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't playing games. I wasn't being dramatic. I was a 67-year-old man whose instincts, built over decades of working with contractors and city officials and budget committees, were telling him that something was wrong. And the most important thing I'd learned in 31 years of civil engineering was this: don't start demolition until you know what's inside the walls. So I kept quiet. The whiteboard stayed on the counter. When Kim called, I kept my voice slightly strained, slightly effortful, the way I'd been speaking when I was genuinely struggling with disorientation. I didn't lie, exactly. I just didn't update her. She asked how my vision was. I said the same. She said she was coming over Thursday. Thursday, she came alone. Spencer had a showing, she said. She helped me sort through some mail, made us both tea, and then sat across from me at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around her mug and said, "Dad, I want to talk to you about something." I looked at her. I kept my expression soft, slightly uncertain. I'd learned in the past few weeks to do a very good imitation of a man whose world is not quite in focus. "Spencer and I have been talking," she said. "And we're worried about you being here alone. About the long term." I wrote on the whiteboard, "I'm okay. I have friends." "I know," she said, "and we're not trying to take anything away from you. We just think, and I've talked to a few people, and Patrick agrees." I held up my hand. I wrote, "Patrick knows about this?" I mentioned it to him. "He's worried too, Dad." That one landed somewhere tender. I kept my face neutral. "There are really good facilities," she said. "Not nursing homes, nothing like that. Independent living communities. You'd have your own space, people around, activities. And the house." She paused. "The house is a lot for one person to maintain. Financially, it could give you a really comfortable cushion if you sold." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I wrote, "I need to think about it." She reached across and squeezed my hand. Her eyes were warm. She looked like her mother. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because I was angry, not yet. I was something more complicated than angry. I was in that suspended state that comes before anger. The one where you're still hoping you're wrong, still hoping there's an interpretation you haven't considered yet, still hoping the person you love is not the person the evidence suggests. I called Patrick the next morning. He picked up on the second ring. I told him Kim had talked to me. There was a half-second pause that told me everything I needed to know about how surprised he wasn't. "Dad," he said carefully, "I just told her I was worried about you. I didn't tell her to push you about the house." "Did she mention the house to you?" Another pause. "She mentioned that it might simplify things." "She used that word? Simplify." "Dad." "Patrick, I need you to be straight with me." He exhaled. "She said you'd been struggling, that maybe the house was more than you could manage, that if you moved somewhere, the sale could, yeah, she talked about what it could do financially for you. For me. He said it like he half believed it. I told him I loved him and I'd talk to him soon. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a while. The morning light was coming through the window over the sink, sharp and clear, the kind of winter morning light that makes everything look clean and precise. I could see every line of the grain in the wooden tabletop. I could see the bird feeder in the backyard, could see a junco pecking at seeds, could count its wing beats as it startled and lifted away. I could see just fine. I started paying closer attention. Not in a sneaky way exactly, more the way you pay attention when you're not sure if the foundation is settling or sinking. You watch, you document, you wait for the pattern to become clear. The next time Kim and Spencer came over together was a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks later. They brought lunch from a deli I liked. Spencer was chattier than usual, asking about the house, how old the roof was, whether the furnace had been serviced, what I'd paid for the back deck renovation in 2019. I answered plainly. I had nothing to hide about any of it, but I noticed he was writing things in his phone under the table. After lunch, Kim went to use the bathroom. Spencer and I were alone in the dining room. He leaned back in his chair and said, with the ease of a man who thinks he's among allies, "You know, the market in Lakewood is really strong right now. Your place, in this condition, on this lot, you'd be looking at somewhere between 450 and 480. Easy." I raised my eyebrows slightly, the way a man with limited vision might, processing slowly. "Could be a real nest egg," he said. "Something you could live on for a long time, in the right place." I wrote on the whiteboard. I still carried it with me into other rooms, as though I needed it. "That's good to know." He smiled. "Just something to think about." Just something to think about. I thought about it, all right. I thought about it for the next 3 days while I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my attorney, a woman named Barbara Schiff who had handled Norma's estate and who I trusted completely. I laid out what was happening, what I suspected. She asked good questions, sharp ones. She said that if my concern was that family members were positioning to gain control of my assets under the guise of cognitive or physical decline, there were steps I could take, concrete steps. She walked me through them. The second call was to my financial advisor, a man named Ted, who I'd worked with for 12 years. I told him I wanted to restructure some things. He didn't ask why. He just asked what I wanted. I told him. Over the next 3 weeks, while Kim brought over casseroles and Spencer asked careful questions about the house and both of them spoke to me in the slightly slowed, slightly louder voices people use for the elderly and infirm, over those 3 weeks I quietly reorganized my life. I updated my will. I put the house into a revocable living trust with Ted and Barbara as co-trustees and Patrick as successor trustee. Patrick, who I'd decided to trust because when I'd pressed him he'd told me the truth, even the uncomfortable parts. I set up a power of attorney structure that was airtight, that Barbara described as the kind of thing that would survive a challenge. I put the important documents in a fireproof lockbox and put the lockbox in a location that only Patrick and Barbara knew. I wasn't disinheriting Kim. I want to be clear about that. Nothing I did was out of spite. Everything I did was out of self-preservation, the quiet, unhurried kind, like tightening the bolts you can reach before the storm comes. The moment of clarity came on a Friday evening in late January. Kim and Spencer had come over, and after dinner, another deli spread. They were nothing if not consistent. Kim said she'd brought some brochures. She set them on the table with the practiced casualness of someone who'd been practicing. 3 glossy pamphlets, full-color photographs of smiling silver-haired people playing shuffleboard and sitting in bright common rooms. "This one's the nicest," she said, sliding one toward me. "It's in Avon Lake. Really beautiful. And Dad, the financial guy there, I talked to him. He's really helpful. He said a house like this would more than cover the entrance fee and give you a really comfortable monthly stipend." I picked up the pamphlet. I looked at it. I turned it over slowly. Spencer said, "The waiting list can be long for the good ones. If we start the process now." "Now?" I said. They both looked at me, not because of what I'd said, but because of how I'd said it, clearly, without strain, without the careful half-volume of a man managing impaired perception. I set the pamphlet down. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, with the full weight of two eyes that worked just fine, and I said, "How long have you been planning this?" The silence in that kitchen was something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Not the angry silence of a confrontation, the specific silence of people who've been caught somewhere between what they told themselves they were doing and what they were actually doing. Kim's face went through several things quickly. Surprise first, then confusion, then this is the one that stays with me. A flash of something that looked almost like relief. Like she'd been holding her breath and hadn't known it. "Dad," she said, "your vision." "Came back," I said, 6 weeks ago. Spencer stood up. I don't know why exactly. Some reflex of a man who expects to manage his way out of situations. We were just trying to. "I know what you were trying to do," I said. "I wasn't loud. I've never been a loud man. Spencer, I want you to wait in the living room, please." He looked at Kim. She looked at her hands. He left the room. I sat across from my daughter at the kitchen table where she'd eaten 10,000 meals growing up, where she'd done her homework in high school, where we'd sat the morning after Norma died and held on to each other and cried until we couldn't anymore. "I'm not going to tell you what I think of this," I said. "You're smart enough to know. I'm going to tell you what I've done." I told her about the trust, about the will, about Barbara and Ted and Patrick and the lockbox. I told her that the house was no longer solely in my name and hadn't been for 3 weeks. I told her that if anyone tried to challenge my competency in court, they would be doing so against the legal structure that Barbara described as, and I quoted directly, "extremely well defended." Kim was crying by the time I finished. Not the crying of someone caught in a scheme, more complicated than that. The crying of someone who'd let themselves be led somewhere they weren't sure they'd wanted to go, who could see clearly now how far they'd drifted. "Spencer," she said finally. "He was the one who—" "I know," I said. "I watched his face when he didn't know I could see it." She covered her mouth with her hand. "I'm not asking you to leave him," I said. "That's your life. But I am asking you to understand that I see what happened here. All of it. And things need to change." She nodded. She was still crying. I got up and put the kettle on because that's what you do. That's what Norma would have done. You put the kettle on and you wait for the water to boil and you figure out what comes next. Spencer left that night without speaking to me again. Kim stayed for another hour. We talked, really talked, for the first time in months, maybe longer. She told me things about her marriage I hadn't known, things that made me understand the shape of what had happened, even if they didn't excuse it. I listened. I didn't offer opinions I hadn't been asked for. I just listened. When she left, she hugged me at the door for a long time. I held on too. The following Sunday, I called Patrick. "How are you doing, Dad?" he asked. "I can see just fine," I said. There was a pause, and then he laughed. The real laugh, the unguarded one he's had since he was a kid. "Yeah?" "Yeah," I said. "Have been for a while." "And you didn't tell Kim?" "Not right away." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm guessing things are sorted on your end. Legally." "Barbara would like to think so." "Good," he said. And then, "I'm sorry I didn't push back harder when she first brought it up." "You told me the truth when I asked," I said. "That's what I needed." We talked for 40 minutes after that, about his girls, about a hiking trip he was planning, about whether I'd consider coming out to Denver for Christmas. I said I'd think about it. I meant it as a guess. I'm still in the house, still in Lakewood. I had the furnace serviced last month. And the roof's got at least 5 good years left, according to the man who came to inspect it. The bird feeder's full. I can see the juncos from the kitchen window most mornings, small and quick against the white of the yard. Kim and I are not where we were. I don't think we'll get all the way back, not to that particular version of things. But we talk. She comes over sometimes without Spencer, and we have coffee, and we don't pretend. That's worth something. Maybe it's worth more than the easier version, the one where you don't know what people would say if they thought you couldn't see them clearly. Here's the thing nobody tells you about losing a sense. Even temporarily, you learn, in that time, to pay a different kind of attention. You listen harder. You read the room differently. You notice the things that were always there that you'd stop seeing because you didn't have to work to see them. Getting my vision back didn't put me back where I started. It put me somewhere further along, a little clearer, a little less willing to look away from the things that are hard to look at. I pressed my palm to the kitchen table this morning, feeling the grain of the wood under my hand, and I thought, this is mine. Not forever. Nothing's forever. But for now, it's mine, and I know what it's worth, and I know exactly who I'm leaving it to. That's enough. That's more than enough. I keep coming back to that morning in the parking lot of Dr. Kellerman's office, sitting in my car with my hands on the wheel, being able to read the sign on the building across the street, really read it, sharp and clear, and knowing that I had a decision to make before I started the engine. What I did in the weeks that followed wasn't clever. I don't think of it that way. It was just paying attention, watching what was already there, which I'd been too trusting to look at before. There's a kind of cost to that trust, the long, easy kind you build with someone over decades, because it teaches you to stop reading the room. You assume warmth, because warmth has always been there. And then one day you're sitting across the table from your daughter and her husband, and you realize the warmth you're feeling is from a fire they built, and you're the one who's supposed to be burning. I don't think Kim is a bad person. I've thought about this a lot, more carefully than she probably imagines. What I think is that she let herself be led. By Spencer, by the logic of money, by the slow drift that happens when someone you live with keeps reshaping the way you see things until their version of reality feels like your own. That's not an excuse. But it's a difference. Bad people don't cry the way she cried that night. They don't stay for another hour and tell you things they've never said out loud before. What I learned, and I mean really learned, not the kind of thing you nod at in a greeting card, is that integrity only shows up under pressure. Not the pressure of crisis, necessarily. The quieter pressure of opportunity. Of what you could get away with if you tried. Kim and Spencer saw an opening, and they walked toward it. I needed to understand that about them, and I needed to understand it clearly before I could make any decision about what came next. I also learned something about myself. There's a version of me that would have confronted them the night I saw Spencer on the phone. Stormed in, said my piece, made sure everyone knew I wasn't as diminished as they thought. That version of me would have felt righteous for about a week, and then been left with nothing, no legal protection, no clarity, no real resolution. Instead, I waited. I made the phone calls. I built something solid before I said a word. 31 years of engineering teaches you that the structure has to come before the reveal, or the whole thing falls apart. Getting my vision back didn't just restore my sight, it restored my understanding that the world requires both, the willingness to see clearly, and the patience to act on what you see at the right moment, not the first moment. Those two things together are what kept me in my house, in my life, on my own terms. I'm not angry at Kim anymore. I was for a while in the weeks after that Friday night, a cold, quiet anger that I carried around like a stone in my coat pocket. But I set it down eventually, because holding on to it was costing me something I'd rather spend elsewhere. What I kept instead was the lesson, that love is not the same as trust, and trust is not the same as proof, and proof is something you gather slowly with your eyes open before you act. Patrick called last week. His older daughter lost her first tooth. He sent me a photo, her gap-toothed grin. Proud as anything, I could see it perfectly. That's not nothing, that's everything.